Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. Happy New Year to everyone. This video is being made on January 1st, 2021. I think everybody's looking forward to 2021 being a better year than 2020. All right, I thought in today's video we'd talk about transpositions in the opening. So we're going to start by defining what a transposition is, and then we'll look at some of the maybe more common or important ones. It's really quite a big subject. We could do 10 videos on transpositions and openings and we still wouldn't cover the whole thing. In fact, I have a book in front of me here called Transpo Tricks in Chess by Andy Soldis. So he has an entire book on transposition tricks, and it's like 200 and some pages. So let's define what a transposition is. A transposition is going from one opening into another through a different move order. Okay, so let's give an example. Let's say you're playing e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Okay, well, very often in this position, white will play a Roy Lopez, or I'll play an Italian game, or I'll play a Scotch game. Could you get to the same position by transposition? Well, you could play knight f3, and if your opponent plays knight c6, the best move here is to take advantage of the fact that he's blocked his c-pawn, which is important in d-pawn openings, and play d4. And if he plays d5, you've reached a good line in the d-pawn openings where black has blocked his knight. But if you don't know d-pawn openings and you don't want to try to take advantage of that, you could certainly play e4, and now black has the opportunity to play e5, and now you're in the exact same position. So that's what was called a transposition. In fact, that first move we looked at, knight f3, there's I think a several volume set of Vladimir Kramnik's openings where he opens the game knight f3. Now knight f3 is called the ready opening, but the ready opening is only if it remains independent and into a knight f3 kind of opening. So for instance, if black plays d5, the most common move against knight f3, at least in the old days, and white plays c4, at least for this moment, we have a ready opening. But white doesn't have to do that. So for instance, suppose white plays d4 and black plays knight f6 and white plays c4 and black plays e6. Well, this is now transposing into a queen's gambit decline. Normally you would see that in this move order, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, and we reach the exact same position by transposition. This is the more normal way to play that opening, but there's certainly nothing wrong with playing knight f3 first. And if your opponent plays d5, say, oh good, normally he plays an Indian defense. Now I've got him to play d5, let's get him into a double queen pawn opening, which he's not familiar with. That's one of the reasons you do transpositions. For instance, suppose you know your opponent likes to play a Nimzo Indian. And you know if you play d4, he'll play knight f6, c4, e6, and if you like to play knight c3, he plays bishop to d4. And you say that's what he always likes to do when people play d4. So you open the game knight f3, and your opponent says, oh, well, I should grab the center and I'll play d5. And then you say, all right, I didn't really want to play a ready opening. I just wanted to play a queen pawn opening where you play something that you don't normally play. I'll play d4, and now you can't play a Nimzo Indian anymore because Nimzo Indians don't have pawns on d5 so early. There are lines in a Nimzo where the pawn gets to d5, but not in the first 2 or 3 moves. So you've forced a transposition into an opening that maybe your opponent doesn't want to play that you do. Maybe normally you play d4, but you don't like to play against the Nimzo Indian, so you play knight f3 first. This is the kind of thing that Vladimir Kramnik and many other grandmasters like to do. They like to play flexible moves that could transpose into other things. So for instance, if black plays c5 here, white could transpose into the symmetric English. Why do I call it a transposition? Well, because normally the symmetric English would start out with white playing c4, and black has a choice of what he wants to play, and if he plays c5, that's called symmetric English for obvious reasons, and then knight f3 is one of the main moves here. So if you play knight f3 and your opponent plays c5, you can say, okay, I'll play symmetric English. Or you could stick into a more ready kind of King's Indian attack game with playing g3. Or you could do another transposition. You could transpose into a Sicilian. You could play e4, and voila, we've got the same position you would get if you had played e4, c5, knight f3. We're now in the main line of the Sicilian, yet we've gotten there by playing knight f3 first, which certainly doesn't look like a Sicilian kind of move. There's just millions of ways that you can transpose through moves. Let's go through some common inaccuracies that people think are transposing that are not. Now, if you haven't seen my earlier video called Common Opening Inaccuracies, I recommend it because I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But let's say you play d4 and black plays knight f6 and you play c4, and black thinks, oh, I'm in a normal opening here, I'll play d5. Or maybe he plays d5 first and you play c4, and he says, oh, he's attacking my pawn, I'll guard it with a knight. This is inaccurate. Why? Because white's going to get in an AWL. If you don't know what AWL is, attack it with something worth less, then you should watch that video too. That would be very helpful. These are all videos on my channel. C takes d5. If he takes with the queen, you AWL the queen with knight c3. If you AWL a piece early in the opening and it helps your development and he has to waste time moving a piece twice, we call that winning a tempo. So pretty much every winning a tempo is an AWL, but not every AWL is winning a tempo. All right, if black takes with the knight, the main move here for white is to play knight f3 followed by e4. But most people don't know that. They just play the AWL e4 first, which is just as good if you ask the computer, but it's a lot more tricky. So I tell people, if you don't know all the tricks, just play knight f3 and then play e4. It saves you a lot of figuring things out. But e4 right away is good. And this is an AWL that'll force the knight to move again. And black has some problems here. The best move here for black is probably e5. Okay, so knight f6 is not really a transposition into anything if white punishes him and takes the pawn and does an AWL. Let's say knight here, e4, with a big advantage to white. But let's say white doesn't know that. Let's say white's not a very strong player, and he doesn't know he's supposed to take the pawn and get an AWL. If he mistakenly plays knight c3, black has a choice of transposing into lots of openings that are very reasonable. He can play a g6, which is a Grunfeld. He could play e6, which transposes into a Queen's Gambit declined. And he could play c6, which transposes into a Slav. So we've got a lot of transpositional possibilities, but none of them are correct for white. White shouldn't let black transpose into those. He should punish black by taking the pawn. This is probably a good time to also note that if you like to play semi-Slavs, there's often lots of chances to transpose into semi-Slavs. For instance, if white plays knight f3 and you play knight f6, and white plays d4 and you play, let's say, d5, and he plays c4 and you play e6, which is Queen's Gambit declined, if he plays knight c3 now, you can play c6 and go into a semi-Slav, which you could have gotten originally with d4, d5, c4, c6, and now knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6 is the semi-Slav. Well, we've gotten to the same position by a completely different transpositional move order. You know, we've done things like knight f3, d5. You know, we could even play ready here, c4, and black plays e6. And white says, oh, I'll play d4, and black plays knight f6, and white plays knight c3, and black goes c6. Main line, semi-Slav. Now, when white plays bishop g5, we have more transpositions. Black can stay in the main lines, which are pawn takes pawn, leading to things like the Botvinnik system, the really complicated lines. But let's say black says, oh my goodness, against bishop g5, I didn't study all those complicated lines with pawn takes pawn. What can black do? Well, black could transpose into a Queen's Gambit declined. He could play bishop e7 instead of pawn takes pawn. And after e3, we're in the same line of the Queen's Gambit decline that we would get into if we had played d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, knight f3. Now normally black castles, but he can transpose with c6, e3, castles. And we have a main line of the Queen's Gambit declined, but we got there because black didn't want to play the Botvinnik system in the semi-Slav. So we have all these transpositions. Another transposition there would be, let's say you play e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, c6, knight f3. Black could say, all right, instead of pawn takes pawn, instead of Queen's Gambit decline, I'll go into the Cambridge Springs, which with knight bd7. So again, there's lots of ways to get to these positions. The more familiar you are with these positions, and the more you realize that your pattern recognition gets to the exact same place when you get to these positions. I've had lots of my students, they get to the exact same position, and they think it's a different position because they're not used to the move order, and it fools them that they've gotten there. All right, let's look at another famous inaccuracy, which I see all the time, and a lot of people are unaware. Let's say white plays Italian game, and black plays the two knights defense. Well, the main move here is to play knight to g5, but it's not the only move. Let's say white says, black's attacking my pawn, I'll play the very natural knight c3. This is a famous opening inaccuracy. Why is it inaccurate? Because if black knows his openings here, he should play knight takes e4. And this is good for black. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think I spent some time in that other opening inaccuracy video. But basically, this is called the center fork trick. If white takes with a knight, black forks. The best white move, I think, is bishop d3. Pawn takes, bishop takes, and black is equalized. Instead of playing knight takes knight, white could also play bishop takes check. I see that a lot. King takes, knight takes, d5, AWL, knight checks, king g8. And soon black's going to play h6 and drive that knight away with a giant center. And the bishop pair, big advantage to black. This is not nearly as good a line as that bishop d3 line we just did. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, knight c3 is a mistake. But we could get there by a lot of other move orders that's the same mistake. For instance, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now white plays knight c3. Okay, usually black plays knight f6. This is called the four knights game. What's the main moves against the four knights game? Bishop b5 is one, knight d5 is one, d4 is one, but a move that's not is bishop c4, which transposes into what we just saw. Black can play knight takes e4 with the center fork trick. Notice the center fork trick doesn't work when the bishop's on c5 because the knight takes and hits the bishop. You can't play the center fork trick in that position. But here the center fork trick is the main idea for black. And it's not that black's winning, but black is equalized, and this is inaccurate for white to allow this. And we can see this position you can get to this position by an awful lot of move orders. Let's try another one. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. That's the Petrov's defense. Okay, well, the main line in the Petrov's defense is to play knight takes e5. But suppose white doesn't know that or doesn't want to play it, and instead he plays knight c3. Well, if black plays knight f6, here we go again. Bishop c4, inaccurate. He can take the pawn. Or, let's say white plays the Gambit line, bishop c4, and says, go ahead, take my pawn. And black's worried about that. And he says, I think I'll just guard my pawn instead. And now white says, okay, well, I'll play knight c3. Well, bad move, knight c3, transposing into the knight takes line. What should have white played again? Well, we're in the two knights defense. He should just play knight to g5, or he could play d3, which is a modern move. He could play the Max Lang attack with d4. So there's lots of things that he could play. And notice we've transposed. This is the Petrov's. But by playing bishop c4 and knight c6, we've transposed into the main line of the two knights defense. Again, there's just a million transpositions. We can go on and on and on and on about all the different ways you can get to the same position by making reasonable move orders. And sometimes when you make these transpositions, you gain something because you avoid certain lines, but then you lose something by allowing certain other lines on the way. So you have to be careful about whether you want to do that or not. Let's take a look at the Sicilian. White plays e4, c5. Now the open Sicilian is where white on the second and third move plays knight f3 and d4. So for instance, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes, knight f6, knight c3. a6 is the very popular Najdorf variation. Now when white plays e4, c5, knight c3, very often white's going for a closed Sicilian or a Grand Prix attack. But he could be going for a transpositional trick as well. The main move against knight to c3 is to play knight to c6. And if he plays a Grand Prix attack, you have a choice of the main line, which is the fianchetto, or maybe the e6 line. But suppose after knight c6, white says, oh, but you can't play a Najdorf with an early knight c6. I'm just going to play like knight e2, which is called the Sicilian chameleon. Now, if black doesn't want white to play d4, he could play e5 and prevent transpositions. But let's say black instead plays something like d6. Well, now white can play d4, and after pawn takes, knight takes, black can't play a Najdorf. He has the knight on c6, so he can't transpose. So instead, black's going to have to play a classical Sicilian, or he could play some sort of Taimanov kind of system with e6, or a Scavenigan, could transpose into a Scavenigan, again, transpositions. So this move order for white, where white plays knight c3 first, and then plays knight e2, the detriment is it allows black to lock the center like this. The advantage is if black doesn't lock the center like that, black has to play a Sicilian with the knight c6 lines in the Sicilian. If he plays g6, white can play d4, c takes d4, knight d4, bishop g7, bishop e3, and now we've transposed into the main line of the accelerated dragon. So there's all kinds of transpositional possibilities. If white plays e4 and black plays c5, and white plays knight f3 and black plays d6, you know, white could stop and wait and see what black does. He could play knight c3 first before he plays d4 to see if he can entice black into playing the e5 lines to try to stop it. Meanwhile, black has the same decision to make. Let's say white plays knight c3 and black does want to play a Najdorf. Well, d6 is not the main move against knight c3, but it's not a bad move either. And if black wants to transpose into a Najdorf, he can play d6. And now if white plays the Sicilian chameleon, and black plays knight f6, and white plays d4, well, voila. C takes d, knight takes d4, a6, and black has gotten what he wants. He's gotten into the main line of the Najdorf by transposing with that d6 move. Notice he didn't commit himself to knight c6. The problem being that if white doesn't play the transposition into the open Sicilian, maybe d6 is not the right move for black. For instance, if white wants to play one of those lines like the, let's say it goes into the closed Sicilian and black wants to play the e6, d5 lines, he's going to lose a tempo because he already put the pawn on d6 and he can't play the pawn to d5 in one move. So if that's the kind of lines he likes to play against this, then he's been tricked into playing a different line. Is that a problem for black? Not if he knows what he's doing, but if that's the line that he's studied and he doesn't know this, then that can be a problem. It's not that d6 is a mistake, of course. Let's say a stockfish after e4, e5, knight c3. Right now I have a stockfish without a book in it. So stockfish, if I let you think here, without knowing about all these transpositions, what move would you play? Well, right now he's looking at that interesting move, a6, which could transpose into a Najdorf, but it could also transpose into an O'Kelly variation of the Sicilian. And now he's changed his mind and he's saying, well, maybe not maybe not a6, maybe knight c6. And he's even looking at white now playing knight ge2, which is the Sicilian chameleon. And now he's back to that a6 move. I don't see too many people play a6 here, and usually when they do, it's because they think they're playing the O'Kelly system. Okay, so anyway, transpositions. There's just so many of them. No matter what opening we really look at, there's transpositions, as I said, all over the place, especially as I said earlier in the video where we looked at the queen's pawn transpositions. Those are quite common. You also see transpositions into Frenches and Caro-Cans. You know, all kinds of openings can become other openings. Let's say you like the Black-Mar-D-Mar Gambit, and you play d4 and black plays d5, and you say, aha, Black-Mar-D-Mar. The idea is if you take that pawn, I'll attack it with a knight, and if you try to save it, I'll sack this pawn, and if you take it, I get my Black-Mar-D-Mar Gambit, and I get development. Well, but after d4, d5, if you play e4, suppose black says, oh, I'm not a Black-Mar-D-Mar fan. I don't know very much about it. But when white plays e4, I do play the French, so I'll play e6, and now we've transposed into the main line of the French. From the Black-Mar-D-Mar Gambit right to the French. Or if he doesn't like the French, he goes, oh, I like the Caro-Can. Well, c6, we've transposed into the main line of the Caro-Can. Suppose he wants to wait a move. Suppose after d4, d5, e4, d takes e4, knight c3, black says, nah, I don't know about this gambit. He could just play c6, and if white takes the pawn, again, we're back into the Caro-Can. Now, white doesn't have to take the pawn. He can offer a gambit now with f3, but black's offering a transposition into the main line of the Caro-Can, of the classical Caro-Can. So again, we're getting out of a queen pawn opening into a king pawn opening. Suppose you like to play d4 and then bishop f4, which is a London. Okay, well that's pretty much that's a system. There's a difference between a system and an opening in the sense that openings like the Grunfeld and the Roy Lopez require the exact same moves from both players. But on bishop f4, you could say if he plays a knight f6 and I play bishop f4, I'm in a London. But if he plays d5 and I play bishop f4, I'm also in a London, even though we did not transpose into the exact same position yet. If black doesn't want to play a London, he could play a Dutch, and then if you play bishop f4, it's not really a London, it's more like a bishop f4 against the Dutch. And again, we have all these transpositional possibilities. For instance, if white plays an early c4 in a London, it could become a queen's gambit with the bishop f4. For instance, d4, d5, c4, queen's gambit, e6, knight c3, knight f6. And now instead of the main line, bishop g5, suppose you play the bishop f4 line, which is, you know, played occasionally by grandmasters. Well, that's a queen's gambit decline, but what happens if we play d4, like knight f6, bishop f4, and white plays e6, and, sorry, black plays e6. If white plays something like knight f3, d5, and white decides, instead of playing a London kind of move like e3, he wants to play c4, well, now we're getting already transpositions into a queen's gambit decline with the bishop f4 variation, even though we started out as a London. Let's see. More and more transpositions. They're just all over the place. A lot of people open up c4 for the English, and it remains in English, for instance, if black plays a Sicilian reverse with e5. But suppose black wants to play another move. Let's say he plays e6. Well, if white plays knight c3 and black plays d5, black in some lines is threatening to play d4. And if white stops him with d4, voila, we've got a queen's gambit declined again, right out of an English. So it's very, very easy to transpose into c4, d4 openings out of the English if black doesn't play either the c5 symmetric English or the Sicilian reverse with e5. If he plays the flexible knight f6, if white wants to transpose right away, he could play d4, and that would get into it. Or white could delay that and say, let me wait and see what you're doing here. Let me play knight c3, and black says, I think I'll fianchetto the bishop, and white says, I'll play e4 now, threatening e5, and black says, I'll stop that, and white says, okay, I'll play d4, and black plays bishop g7. Well, guess what we have? We have the main line of the King's Indian. Normally, it would be d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. But instead, we got the exact same position with c4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, e4, d6, d4, bishop g7. Transposition. This kind of stuff happens all the time. Or let's say white likes the Botvinnik system, where he wants to play like c4, and then if black plays a move like e5, knight c3, g6, e4, bishop g7, g3. Let's say black plays knight c6, bishop g2. Black could put the knight on e7 or f6. Let's say he puts it on f6. Knight ge2, castle, castle, d6, d3. This is called the Botvinnik system for white, with the pawns like this and the fianchetto and the knight on e2. Well, we just got there by starting with the English opening with c4, followed by knight c3. But there's a million ways to get to that position. You know, we could have played e4 and black could have played a Pierce, and then we could play c3. Black could attack our pawn. We could guard it. He could go to fianchetto. We could play d3 first. He could then play bishop g7, g3, castle, bishop g2, let's say e5, knight ge2, knight c6, castle. And by completely different move order, we reach the exact identical transpositional position. And as I said, we could kind of go on all day, that very often there's very reasonable moves that get to the same position, and you want to be able to recognize, oh, now I'm here, or now I want to get here. What should I do if I want to get to there? How do I get from point A to point B in the opening? And you want to take care in your move order, because as we saw, there's some ways you can mess up. As I said, if you're black and you want to play a Grunfeld, you have to play g6 first, and after knight c3, then play d5. If you think you can play d5 first, it doesn't work. He takes the pawn, and then he's going to AWL you here. So, got to be careful getting to those same move orders. And again, if white wants to avoid the Grunfeld, after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, instead of playing knight c3, where black can play d5 and trade off the knights, these days sometimes grandmasters play interesting moves like f3. And you say, well, that blocks the knight and it opens up the diagonal and the king. That can't be good. But if you know black's a Grunfeld player and he plays d5, you take the pawn, and when the knight takes, you AWL him, and he doesn't have any knight to take there, so he's just going to have to move the knight back, and white's just going to set up a bigger center than normal. So this doesn't transpose into a Grunfeld. White's using a transpositional trick to avoid it. But then black could try to take advantage of that. Instead of playing d5, he could say, well, if you're going to play f3, I'm going to play c5. And of course, here you could transpose into a Benoni line. If d5, bishop g7, knight c3, d6, e4, we've transposed into an f3 line in the Benoni. So you've got transpositions. Even in the mainline King's Indian, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, bishop e2, castle, knight f3. The main line here is e5, which does not lose a pawn. If you don't know why, I have an earlier video on the mainline King's Indian. But suppose black doesn't want to play mainline King's Indian. He could play c5, and now white has transpositional possibilities. If white castles and black takes and white takes, believe it or not, we're in the Maroczy bind of the Sicilian dragon, classical dragon, Maroczy bind, or accelerated dragon. Well, it's not accelerated dragon because there's no knight on c6 yet. If black plays knight c6, this can be a direct transposition into the accelerated dragon. It could be an e-pawn opening. Or, if white instead plays d5, now we have a Benoni. How do we get normally to a Benoni? Normally a Benoni is d4, knight f6, c4, c5, and then d5. Well, if black now plays d6 and white plays knight c3 and g6 and e4, bishop g7, here we go again. We're getting back to that same kind of Benoni. So it's very easy to transpose into accelerated dragons versus Benonis versus King's Indians. You know, even though one's an e-pawn opening, as we said, if white, you know, if black goes into a King's Indian, and then decides instead of playing e5 to play c5, castle, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight c6. Where have we seen this before? Well, let's go back. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes, knight takes, g6, accelerated dragon, c4, Maroczy bind, bishop g7. You could also play knight f6 first. We could do that. Knight f6, knight c3. If he plays bishop, well, let's say he plays d6 to stop e5 at some point. Bishop e2, bishop g7, castle, castle. This is the same position we just saw, where right now we played a Sicilian, and in the other line we played a King's Indian, where black offered transposition of the Benoni and white said no thanks, and black instead went into an accelerated dragon. So you have to be aware of all these tricks. Well, we've used up more than one video worth of time. As I said, we could go on and on and on, but you get the idea. You want to be aware of these ideas so that when you're playing the lines, you're not like, oh, I didn't know I was in a X opening. I thought I was in a Y opening. You want to be aware of what the patterns are. If you saw the Queen's Gambit, where Beth sits there at night and reads MCO with a, she's watching it on the ceiling. I used to use a little pocket set. We go through these lines and we say, oh, yeah, I've seen this position before. And your brain recognizes these patterns. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please let somebody else know about the channel, Dan Heisman Chess here on YouTube. If you'd like to like the video, that's a like for me. And of course, we want you to subscribe. And the best thing is pass the word. Thanks a lot. See you next time and have a good New Year. Bye.